Okay, so I have the pleasure to welcome Yvonne Walz, who is a wonderful scholar, but also a wonderful colleague, and we work together on a project right now. I will tell you a few things about Yvonne before we get started. Yvonne is the head of the Environmental Vulnerability and Ecosystem Services Division of the United Nations University EHS. She has expertise in a large number of areas, including understanding drivers of risk, identifying ecosystem-based approaches to reduce current and future risks, and evaluating adaptation strategies to impacts of climate change. She's been leading and managing multiple projects in these fields, and with a particular focus on climate change research, land and ecosystem-based approaches, and geospatial modeling to monitor indicators of the Sendai framework. There is a lot to say about Yvonne, but you know I've already shared with you her bio, and you found her bio in the link that I provided with the invitation for today. Today, Yvonne is going to give us a talk on the role of ecosystems in the context of global environmental challenges. In this presentation, she will give us a short introduction of the United Nations University and in particular the Institute for Environment and Human Security. And then she will share some research highlights from the Division on Environmental Vulnerability and Ecosystem Services. She will then focus on understanding and leveraging synergies of ecosystem-based approaches to address disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, achieving land degradation, neutrality, and biodiversity goals. I think it's going to be a really interesting talk. Also, I know Yvonne has recently come back from long trips associated with this work, and I look forward to hear all of it. So Yvonne, if you want, you can share your screen and we can start with the talk. Just a note for all the students, if you have questions, please put the questions in the chat. We will make sure to read them at the end of the presentation. After Yvonne is gonna be with us for about an hour. After about 30 minutes, we're gonna have questions and answers. Thank you, Yvonne.
Perfect, thank you so much, everyone. I was just organizing my two screens. Can you see me well and can you see the screen? Okay, that's good. Okay, then first of all, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Super nice to see you all. I'm very happy and surprised to see colleagues, former colleagues, students we are having in our joint master program. So for some of you, it might not be something new because you work with us. But this is very nice to meet you all here. So I have actually the pleasure to spend the next hour with you, and it's for me really a nice opportunity to engage. I planned like 30 minutes about input that we can then have really a very open discussion. I'm happy also if you want to interrupt in between and have questions straight on, we can also do so, but I cannot monitor the chat, so Marta, you would need to help me in this. And if there's some ad hoc questions in between, I'm very open for this as well. Okay, so let's go straight to the topic. I give here this overview what Marta already shared with you. So I start very briefly with UNU-EHS and the EHS division, which I'm leading, then give us some example of our work and some research highlights, and what Marta asked me in particular to share share a little bit more details about our latest policy brief, which we developed together with One Network. And I see here Nidhi, she's also part of this policy brief. So nice to see you here. That gives kind of with this, I will conclude the presentation. Then I think we have enough time to go into more in-depth questions, as this time does not allow to go into the nitty-gritty details of our research. This will be kind of more from an umbrella perspective in terms of what were the key results, what was the context, but then you can please feel free to ask all the detailed questions you're interested in the Q&A afterwards. Okay, first of all to UNU-EHS, you see here this global map of UNU. So we are actually and how do you say it, an institute which is part of a whole UNU family. You see here 13 institutes operating in 12 countries. We are here in the middle. Can you see here UNU-VIE, the Vice Rectorate in Europe, and UNU-EHS, which stands for Institute for Environment and Human Security. And as you see here on this map, that all of these institutes are shared, let's say, located in different regions of the globe. And what is very specific for UNU compared to other universities, for example, any German universities, is that we are working very thematically in that sense. So we have the thematic area of environment and human security. Then there's other institutes, for example, global health in Kuala Lumpur, or we have water in Canada, and we have economics in Finland, etc. So that's kind of very specific for UNU. And at UNU-EHS, we have the key vision actually to focus on a world where people are safe from environmental risks and prosper in harmony with nature. So this is kind of the human security and environment nexus. The mission, what we stand for, is really to create knowledge for a sustainable world. And to create this knowledge, we want to be policy relevant, scientifically sound, but also, how do you say, with a good understanding of how is it relevant for practice. So that's kind of what we try to really unite science, policy, and practice in the way how we conduct also our research. What is our key expertise at UNU-EHS is we focus thematically on risk and adaptation, and another department on transformation, but we also have a postgraduate education stream where you see colleagues in this field here in this program sitting next who can explain more what they experience in our postgraduate education program. You see here, that's the structure of UNU-EHS. We have, as I said, the education. We have the joint master program, also PhD program to be established at this very moment, and the staff capacity building program. And in the risk and adaptation department, where also the division I'm leading here, EVIS, Environmental Vulnerability and Ecosystem Services, located, has overall 5 topics. One is specifically on the ecosystem side. We will learn more about this in a minute. Then we have warm-up really on adaptation planning, risk management, and vulnerability assessment. We have migration, global mountain safeguard research, so the mountain colleagues, and then also Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, where the colleagues who are working on climate risk insurance and finance solutions. And then we have also another department on transformation, which focuses, there's one focus on urban transformation, but in parallel, this is kind of being set up more or less in terms of conceptualizing work in the field of transformation. I would now zoom into our division, the Environmental Vulnerability and Ecosystem Services division at UNU-EHS. We have here 16 team members from 10 countries, overall a very interdisciplinary team with different educational background from, of course, environmental science and geography or ecology, but also forestry, anthropology, sociology, urban science. So we have very different backgrounds, and this is also important in this field because we really want to look at the nexus between people and nature. The overall mission and main goals of our division is to integrate the well-being of nature and people to develop science-based solutions for global challenges. So what is behind this mission is that we really see that there is really the direct link between healthy ecosystems and healthy people, while we have really an impact on people and people's health and well-being if we have non-healthy ecosystems. And I think this is something what we want to research on. How do we bring this, how can we create the evidence, but also solutions as a way forward in the context of the global challenges we are facing right now. There are 3 main goals we are focusing on. On the first side, we are looking at to generate really scientific evidence that advances our understanding of how ecosystems can support disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Just for you to understand, in the context of disaster risk and climate change, we know that ecosystems are impacted on the one hand, but on the other hand, we hear a lot about nature-based solution as a solution to address climate change and to address disaster risk. And this feedback loop and this nexus is something we want to research on and find a way how can we manage ecosystems in a way, or give ecosystems the role that they can be from an impact to a solution. Develop methods for evaluating ecosystem-based approaches for improved climate resilience of people and ecosystems is one key pillar of our research. Only sound methods allow us sound results also, in that sense, to make it scientifically sound. And a third key goal is really now to highlight the diverse values of ecosystems for achieving goals across global policy frameworks. So there are ecosystems are a lot in the context of disaster risk reduction acknowledged for. It is very clear that the global biodiversity crisis is linked to how ecosystems are managed. The sustainable development goals are overall all having some relation to land. That means also to ecosystems. And then we want to make sure also climate change. Ecosystems can be a driver for climate change, can also be a solution to address climate change impacts and adapt to climate change. So this is actually where we want to work in the context that when we look at ecosystems, how can we make sure that we address these different challenges and also the international commitments of in the policy context in a simultaneous way. We see this, as you see here, in a kind of a tree structure, that the stem, the basis for our work is really this methods, the advanced methods to assess social ecological interaction, but also to understand and assess in a more comprehensive way the diverse values of nature, going beyond, for example, economic perspectives to having very diverse values of nature, leading to an advanced understanding of losses and damages of ecosystem services and biodiversity, but also to advance nature-based solutions and targeted nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and interconnected global challenges. I would now come to some highlights of Eva's research in the next, let's say, 10 minutes and give you one very important example, which was accompanying us more or less over the last 3 to 4 years, let's say. It started off with a request coming from UNCCD. So our key mandate also at UNU General is to be the academic arm of the UN. So that is kind of the idea to produce scientific knowledge, to support countries, but also the UN to address frameworks, commitments, to define also goals and targets, and also find ways to address them. And one very relevant request came from the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, that they came back from it was a NAP Expo. I think it was in the context of national adaptation planning, in the context of Paris Agreement implementation, UNFCCC work, and they were attending it and they said, look, there are a lot of examples in climate change adaptation, for example, mangrove afforestation, huge initiatives that are really planned and targeted in a way for climate change adaptation, for example, in the context to combat sea level rise, etc., and to avoid coastal erosion. But at the same time, it was not at all considered in the context of the goals of the UNCCD to achieve land degradation neutrality. Oh, I'm sorry for that. I'm not starting now. And the idea here was really that this was kind of there are many things done, but many things done in silo. And this is specifically in the context of ecosystems. And the request that came now in the context of these convention of the parties, so all these UN agencies have their regular meetings or processes. And here there was this United Nations convention, there was this convention of the parties from the UNCCD, which means that all kind of parties to the UNCCD were actually negotiating and said, well, we want to make sure that these different approaches are understood and that we are having a coherent understanding of what when land is managed, when do we address different goals and what is the synergies and what is the difference. So they had this specific request at this COP14 to work in coordination with other Rio conventions and relevant partners to ensure coherence and alignment in the way ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction to address disaster risk, nature-based solutions as a general term, which is also not well defined at that stage, and sustainable land management, which is the approach under the UNCCD, is understood and categorized. So this was one research, for example, where UNCCD approached us at UNU-EHS, and then we developed over the year of 1 year this report you can see here, and did a very detailed research and developed a framework to understand the coherence and alignment among these ecosystem-based approaches. You see here on the right side, this is the key result in a nutshell based on this 1 year research. And what I want to show you mainly is that we had here all these, what are challenges, drivers, approaches, what is the assessment behind these, what are benefits or co-benefits, implementation characteristics, etc. So we had a very detailed research on all of these in relation to these individual approaches, and understood in the end, based on developing this framework, that there are very clear differences, which you see here with a vertical separation. So for example, here there are some things that are very specific for an approach versus there are a lot of things which are actually similar and more or less align with each other, no matter on what approach you do. And this was kind of the idea behind this, is to bring any nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches into the discussion, that they address multiple goals at the same time, and to make sure that they are acknowledged also. I can show you some short insight what is specific and what is different. For example,
Yvonne, sorry,
yes?
Yvonne, sorry for interrupting. I think there is a question in the chat that might actually be helpful for everybody. And I'm realizing that some students might not be familiar with the terminology. And I think some students may get a bit confused by the fact that we have expressions like nature-based solutions, but also EBA and eco-DRR. Maybe we can clarify for the students that MBS includes all of this. And
I forgot
maybe
this actually. Yes, this is here.
I was just assuming, but
Yeah.
this is actually just as to emphasize this point, in case it's helpful for students' understanding.
Absolutely, absolutely. Happy to thank you for intervention. So that is actually nature-based solutions means is a very general term to work with ecosystems and biodiversity. So there's a huge, let's say, 5-line definition of nature-based solutions defined by the United Nations Environmental Assembly. And the idea is really to address environmental aspects, to address societal aspects, but not specified to any target, like, for example, disaster risk or climate change. So this is the issue with nature-based solutions, and this is why, according to this request from the UNCCD COP, what was our kind of mandate to do this work, we resulted that nature-based solutions cannot be part of this individual assessment at this level. This is a level higher. This is why we have this umbrella perspective here. And then there are these three terminologies which are very relevant and very, how to say, established approaches in the context of, for example, the UNFCCC for EBA and the EcoDRR for UNDRR. So there are these different UN agencies that work with ecosystems and have in specific approaches. But at the moment, this was a lot working on silos. And this is kind of what UNCCD, as the Convention for Land, took the initiative to make sure, let's clarify what is behind these terms and what does it mean, that we can see how can we harmonize approaches and bring it also to the UNCCD discussion. That was kind of the motivation behind this. And you see here, EBA stands for ecosystem-based adaptation. And this is what is specific for EBA, is that the driver for managing ecosystems in order to address for adaptation is that we have climate-related impacts. And what is also specific is that we need to understand what are the climate risks and climate vulnerability and what are future projections in terms of climate conditions in order to manage ecosystems in a way that we have the specific goal of climate change adaptation. So if thinking about increase of heavy rainfall events or more drier periods, you need to manage ecosystems in a different way, let's say, no? Or if you have sea level rise, or you have glacier melting, it means it has an impact on ecosystems and how you manage ecosystems in order to adapt to climate change conditions. Then this other term here, SLM, stands for Sustainable Land Management, which is the approach under the UNCCD. And sustainable land management is really a reaction or a way to address desertification, land degradation, and drought impacts. What is done in terms of specific assessment is really to understand what is the soil condition, what are water resources, what is the vegetation condition, etc. So these are very land-specific assessment with the idea to combat desertification. Desertification is more or less the degradation of dry lands, to land degradation in general, but also to droughts. That's kind of the overall objectives of the UNCCD Convention. And the third one under these approaches is EcoDRR, which stands for Ecosystem-Based Disaster Risk Reduction, which is an approach which is a reaction to impacts from natural, hydrological, biological, geological hazards overall. That means beyond climate. So this is why it's different. So it's not, EBA cannot be directly also EcoDRR. And it's what is the specific assessment behind here is that we have an hazard, which is the hazard can be, for example, a flood, a drought, an earthquake, a tsunami, etc. Then we have exposure. That means what is exposed in terms of people or ecosystems, and then what are the vulnerabilities. These are specific assessments in the ecosystem, in the disaster risk context. And so this is what is specific for these approaches. But as I said at the beginning, the motivation was to understand also the coherence and alignment among them. And when we developed this, we understood in the process of our research that overall they have really similar or same challenges. You see here in the challenges, it's about food insecurity, water scarcity, threatened livelihoods and economic opportunities, effects on human health, climate change, disaster risk, they are all actually, so climate change is also a challenge which drives also droughts or desertification. So all these challenges are really kind of cross-cutting. Then if you come to the measures in terms of conservation, sustainable use and restoration of land and using sustainable land managed technologies, we are also using the same thing. For example, mangrove afforestation or restoration would be a measure which is actually, you can bring it under EBA, but you can also bring it under all of them. Same implementation characteristics that is specific for these measures is that they have the common characteristics is that including indigenous people-centered approaches that to be transdisciplinary. So these are characteristics that are very important and relevant for all of them. Same with co-benefits. If you manage ecosystems in a sustainable way and restore land, you have social, economic, and environmental co-benefits. So all of this showed us that if it comes to the implementation, and if it comes also to the ultimate goal, namely sustainable development, all these approaches are actually going in the same direction. It's just a matter of how can we make them targeted in reference to specific assessments here. And this is kind of the key result, more or less, out of this first step of the research, how to leverage synergies from mangrove afforestation in Bangladesh, for example, is that if mangrove afforestation is done in Bangladesh, there were many co-benefits produced, you see here, that are having specific outcomes. You have an adaptation to sea level rise or a reduction of coastal land degradation, a reduction of risk due to cyclones or coastal hazards. But as a next step, in order to make this also relevant for monitoring and evaluation, how good is it? How does it work? What is the impact of it? That was something where the suggestion is that in order to do so, there's really the need to do respective assessments in relation to baselines in order to really make this relevant, not only for the one or the other, but for all in general. This resulted in new demand for further research on alignment of other land and water management approaches. I would go quickly over this now because there was, for example, there are many things like agroecology, climate smart agriculture, conservation agriculture, forest landscape restoration, etc. So many of these individual approaches which fall under the one which is in the box if you think about measures, right? So this is in the box of measures, and what we did in this research now is really to understand when does this really contribute to sustainable land management and achieving land degradation neutrality, and where are limitations? And here we worked a lot with criteria and an extensive stakeholder approach. And the key result is really that most approaches contribute to food security and ecosystem health, but there are a lot of gaps concerning human well-being and cross-cutting socioeconomic criteria. So again, here, the idea that, for example, conservation agriculture focuses or forest landscape restoration focuses a lot on the ecosystem health and also food security to some extent, but also on the human well-being, not in specific. And the idea was with this report was really to find entry points to enhance the contribution of these approaches through remedial actions or integration of multiple approaches at a landscape scale to make sure this is complemented in order to address sustainable land management and achieving land degradation neutrality. Another point here, another report also for UNCCD, also a request from the COP15, similar, was to make sure we leverage synergies when national adaptation plans are developed by parties. So every country is developing a national adaptation plan in order to address climate change impacts. And what we wanted to do with this report here is really to make sure that in the process of developing such national adaptation plan, land degradation neutrality as one key goal, and also tools from the UNCCD in terms of integrated land use planning and etc. They are used at the same time in order to make sure that climate change adaptation and land degradation neutrality is implemented and planned synergistically. And this is kind of the next steps, all building on this first request to understand the terminologies, but then find entry points and ways to work with this. I make a very quick break here. I have 3 more slides on EVIS, and then on this policy brief. Is everything clear? Is it too much, I don't know, different stuff?
No, it's very interesting.
I can
Anybody
continue, or we can make a short break right now, or I don't know, what's best?
I think it would be nice to continue, and then we open up for discussion, and we can.
Okay.
There are specific questions on the different types of projects that you have presented.
Okay, perfect. Then I showed you our EVES tree at the beginning. So we have these methodologies, then we have loss and damage, and then we have also nature-based solutions. I started now a lot with all these solution-oriented approach. We also do a lot of research on loss and damage. And this is actually something which we started in 2020 already, to first of all understand drivers of ecosystem degradation and assessing loss of and damage to ecosystem functions and services. What we experience, and this is kind of a result of our experience, that we realized, working a lot also with UNDRR together, that loss and damage of ecosystems and biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services is not recognized. So we have really an issue here that if in terms of any hazards or disasters or climate impacts, there are economic losses, there are impacts on human health, on people, on infrastructure, on critical infrastructure, etc. But there's really not a good understanding of how ecosystems are impacted and what does it mean in the terms, because ecosystems, as I mentioned at the beginning, are also play a key role for disaster risk reduction. And this is what this umbrella shows. Umbrella shows you. This is the figure here is from the IPCC report, which shows actually that hazard, exposure, vulnerability are the three key elements that determine risk. And if you look at what we did here in our research, is that we looked what are losses and damages to ecosystems through a very detailed research, but what are actually, in terms of what we lose, what could help actually for risk reduction at the same time. You see here regulating services for mitigating hazard exposure could reduce hazard if we have them. If we have healthy and integer ecosystems, we have these services that reduce hazard. If we have provisioning and cultural service for building capacity, we can reduce vulnerability in the societal sphere. At the same time, if we have regulating and supporting services for ecosystem resilience, we reduce also ecosystem vulnerability in order to make sure that services can be provided in the long term. These were aspects, has all not been considered in the context of loss and damage. And as a result of this basic research, as a first, this was kind of on the side without a project, just a basic research we did in parallel because we saw the need for it. We developed these policy briefs for example, for the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, and for the next COP, and for the midterm review of the Sendai framework. So for UNDRR and UNFCCC key events, and communicated this message that we need to better understand and make sure that we, also find ways to acknowledge and recognize these losses and damages. And as a next step, what we were now, I was invited last year together with the team to develop a key paper on the non-economic losses in the context of the UNFCCC. They have the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is a process to make sure that loss and damage is we can advance technical assistance and develop knowledge in order to support countries to track and monitor and assess and also compensate at the end loss and damage. And what we did here is develop such a quick framework in terms of if you lose biodiversity, you see here on the left side, if you lose biodiversity in ecosystem services, that this trickles really down immediately, also through ecosystem services themselves, into the societal sphere, in the social ecological system, which we call, and has an impact on human security, on livelihoods, on health and well-being, on dignity, on identity, habitability, opportunity, and society, well, as part of the society. And what we did as an example then is really to showcase what does it mean if a coastal area is impacted from a storm, for example. We see that mangroves, for example, are impacted, but what does it mean if mangroves are impacted beyond, for example, loss of economic losses of, I don't know, fishery or something, or tourists, but we have also loss of intangible cultural heritage, or the self-determination, in a sense that people who live there and identify and have their everyday life spending in this area, in this natural environment, for their livelihoods and for their well-being. So, for example, the sense of place, physical land itself is lost, biodiversity is lost, and heritage. So I think these are just examples. We did develop this paper. You can read more details here. In order to make sure, let's also make sure that there are also non-economic losses which have to be recognized and considered, and sometimes cannot be at the same, how to say, cannot even compensated with any economic terms. So, and I think these are things we wanted to share at that time. And then one more slide on methods. So we had also this STEM in the EHS tree on the methods. Where I want to share with you two examples where we did really kind of a very geospatial explicit approach in order to find a way to produce targeted intervention packages of ecosystem-based adaptation measures to address climate risk hotspots for the example of Peru. So you have here a multi-criteria analysis in terms of what are challenges, what are ecosystems. We have at the same time also what are measures, what are specific measures, where do they fit, where are they relevant, based on a matrix approach. And in the end, we have here for a specific spatial context, really targeted intervention sites map where we have for example, for a landscape scale, 4 or 5 different adaptation interventions targeted to the to the ecosystem context, to the respective challenge, etc. And on the second aspect in terms of methodology, what we did also advance just in the last year is to evaluate ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction measures, in a sense that how does agroforestry, as one example, really contribute to overall risk reduction? What we see a lot is that measures are done and implemented, but what we hardly see is a comprehensive evaluation. How good is it, and how does it really address disaster risk in all its dimensions? We see sometimes evaluations in terms of hazard mitigation, so how much is flood reduced due to a measure, but we hardly see any relation to how does this relate to reduced exposure and to reduced vulnerability implementing this measure, for example. And this is what we did in this paper. I will share all these slides afterwards, so you can go, in case you're interested, you can go in depth in these papers, and I'm always ready to answer any questions, of course. Now, just as a last milestone is to do these ecosystem-based approaches for integrating disaster risk reduction, climate, land, and biodiversity goals. This is the very most recent piece we have developed together in EHS, together with the network, the Partnership of Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction. And I always start with this slide. Why do we need these to integrate multiple goals? If I look, for example, here at the landscape scale, first of all, if we have siloed approaches, it is here you see a lot of scientific evidence that any siloed approaches can compromise the goals of global policy frameworks. That means we have evidence that there is, in West Africa, there's the initiative to plant trees over areas in the size of France, really intense afforestation measures. However, there's also the scientific evidence that this can in several regions really lead to land degradation at the sense because there are not the right species used, because trees are planted in ecosystems which are actually grassland ecosystems from an ecological background. And also, for example, at the same time, this can lead to reduced water holding capacity of the soils, etc. So there are many aspects we need to consider, and this is why we should not focus with initiatives only on climate change adaptation. This is kind of the message behind it when we manage ecosystems. At the same time, we deal with shared challenges and with shared goals. If we look at ecosystems, so ecosystems contribute to climate change, but they also are a solution for climate change at the same time if we manage it right. Soils are the biggest source of carbon and the biggest sink of carbon. And Germany has just in the last year, the forests in Germany have first time become a carbon source instead of a carbon sink because of the situation of forests in Germany. And I think this is something we want to make sure to consider in our land management and ecosystem planning. And it's a matter of resources. Why should we focus only on one when we manage many things at the same time in a strategic, science-based manner? This has led us to this policy brief. You can see here the QR code leads you directly to this publication. It was a joint initiative of this Partnership for Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction network. And the idea of this policy brief is to bring this message to all 3 COPs of the Rio Conventions that happened this last year. So in October was the COP of the CBD in Colombia. In November was the COP of the Convention of Biodiversity. Sorry. In November was the climate COP in Baku, and in December was the COP of the UNCCD, the land COP we call it, in Riyadh. And the idea was that this policy brief is brought to all of these COPs through the network, through people in the network, bringing it there and conveying the message of integrated approaches when managing ecosystems to address multiple goals. We have as a content of this policy brief, just in a nutshell, we have looked at all of these conventions and the Sendai framework as the angle of disaster risk, and looked at what is actually in their resolutions or decisions, goals and targets in relation to ecosystem-based approaches, and all of them have ecosystem-based approaches, and sometimes also synonymously, here you see here, with nature-based solutions in their resolutions and decisions, etc., and also in their goals. And this was kind of for us kind of the basis to jump on and say, yeah, it's all there, you want it all. So let's harmonize the approaches and make sure we leverage them. And then as a next key input of this policy brief is what is out there already in terms of guidance and information and strategies to leverage synergies for national focal points. There's a lot of these national level instruments. For example, the Convention on Biological Diversity has the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. UNCCD has the Land Degradation Neutrality Target Setting Program, etc. And what we did with this national adaptation plans here for UNFCCC and disaster risk reduction strategies for the Sendai framework. And what we did is to look at all what is out there in order for focal points to the CBD to understand how can we integrate disaster risk reduction, how can we integrate climate change, and how can we integrate achieving land degradation neutrality, and vice versa. So what is there is really these guidance documents, and for each we have guidance documents already. So that's kind of a next step, and showing with this figure more or less that ecosystem-based approaches are a connector to address these different Rio Conventions goals and targets in support of implementing really the SDGs in a most efficient and targeted way. The recommendation to scale up ecosystem-based approaches was really to promote and apply spatial planning tools, to be concrete, right? To be really on the ground in the context. It always has a context. To involve science is very important to plan and implement multi-goal oriented ecosystem-based approaches, also for evaluation purposes. And also this can provide an opportunity to leverage diverse financing opportunities for achieving multiple goals simultaneously. With this, I would now actually finish and stop with a bit too long presentation. I'm very sorry.
No, it was
But
very interesting, Yvonne.
I think I'm now back to you here and stop sharing my screen
So
and we can
it
talk.
was, yes, it was a very interesting overview. And we have a question in the chat from Paul Schulze. You can maybe see it is the last question in the chat, but I can read it. Yvonne, you mentioned the aim to implement measures on the landscape scale. I understand this is this as the need to go beyond localized small-scale projects, which I think is a big question right now. For example, how to effectively scale up MBS measures, if scalable at all. But I think that's another question. And then the actual question is, could you elaborate on how the landscape scale is defined, understood in that regard, including its practical boundaries, what on-site challenges there are to implement measures on the landscape scale, and how to overcome them? Thank you, Yvonne.
Yeah, thank you so much. Nice to meet you here, Paul. So in terms of landscape scale, this is also, there can be different scales of landscape scale. What is important is that landscapes are having any connection or relation in terms of, for example, there are hydrological landscape scales. Then they have, in Vietnam, for example, we have one case study area where we have a landscape coming from the coast to the mountain. There are 3 catchments as part of it, but they are so connected that this management or the how to say the management and the planning and the assessment in terms of risk reduction and climate change adaptation really makes sense in such a landscape scale where even 3 catchments are part of it because they are directly connected ecologically, because there's the forest upstream, which is actually having an impact on all of these 3 catchments, for example. So there's not a hard definition of this. Important is that they are more or less, that this is a unit in which we have connections, and in this unit, these connections are understood and elaborated on, and that, for example, in an other area, for example, for the case of nature-based solutions and flooding, in such an example, what I just presented, there's a lot of solutions that need to be done upstream because there is space, because there is anyway a forest which is maybe not managed well at that time, but can be an opportunity, an entry point to implement targeted and let's say sustainable ecosystem-based approaches to address multiple objectives in order to make sure downstream you have less flood risk, etc. These are the aspects for the landscape scale, but maybe you want to formulate your question in a bit more specific way if I'm not addressing it well.
Thank you, Yvonne. There is another question from Ankita. As you talk about shared goals, do you think the current focus on climate change action plans can lead us to creating silos?
As they are planned only focusing on climate change action, they can lead to silos, yes. I think also national adaptation plans are still a siloed approach. A lot of national level policy instruments are siloed approach. When we did our research on this national adaptation plan supplement, we had how to say, we had stakeholder engagement, and we were talking to the national focal point for UNCCD, yeah, at the national level, and at the same time we talked to the national focal point for UNFCCC, and the national focal point from UNCCD did not even know that there's a national adaptation plan. And in the end, all of these plans are aiming to manage and plan and let's say address challenges that the country faces, and it's all somehow located somewhere. No, any measures need to be implemented at a certain location or in a certain region, etc. So this is when this is why this integrated spatial planning would be so important. But I think this also relates a little bit now to this question in terms of how to scale it up. You need, I think, at the policy level, the buy-in that this joint planning is something which is understood and which is encouraged. Otherwise, you cannot go in the local context and do this planning. And I think the scaling up comes from a bottom-up approach, because it's a lot contextual, and I think this is not possible to scale all down, you know. So I think there is these to come from two sides. So I think you need to get the policy and the mandate right, that from a bottom up you can then scale up. I think that's my understanding how we can reach out.
I have a question. There is one more question in the chat, but I have a question too. When we look at, we did a survey here in the US, and the question was, and you are familiar with this because we asked similar questions in the project we did together. And the big challenge to developing sustainable strategies reported by municipal officials is always technical abilities, limited technical expertise. So even when they want to develop something bottom up, which is the only way really in some parts of the US where there is no funds coming from the top, the challenge is that there is inability to do so. This might be a problem in other areas of the world as well. There has to be some guidance, but at the same time, we would like to have participation. But when participation is not possible because there is no ability, do you have any thoughts about this? It's something that is taking a large mental space for me in terms of what do we do.
I understand. We had this discussion at the COP also, actually, in Riyadh a lot, in order to how to get it done on the ground. And I think one point for me is that, well, we are also only starting in this practical experience in terms of doing really. We have now 3 new projects where we start to really work on the ground on, for example, strategic forest restoration activities to address multiple UN goals in Togo, or we do wetland for UN goals in Kenya. So we have different projects, but we are only at the starting point. But what I think is very important in the context and the local level is we need a few very good facilitators and let's say people who coordinate and facilitate the dialogue. But I think we tend to forget that people who are living in this area and maybe do not know GIS or do not know many data, etc., but they can really provide very valuable feedback in terms of what are the diverse values of nature, how do you use nature, and this is kind of, I think, it's very important that we bring also the right people to the dialogue. I think this dialogue, this integration is very important in terms of a very good facilitated dialogue in order to scale it up. Because all the data crunching is not something which is done at the local level, but the knowledge generation and the contextualization is something which needs to be done at the local level. And I think this is often underestimated, what potential is at the local level in that sense.
Thank you, Yvonne. We have 2 more questions here. The first is from Alicia. Hello, Yvonne. Does these EBA solutions on rebuilding, recovering former existing ecosystems or new ones? So I assume are these EBA solutions habitat restoration or habitat creation? And follow-up, following the nonlinear nature of environmental systems, how can EBA be made effective to adapt to future thresholds dynamics, particular with climate change in focus?
Okay, these are 2 questions, 2 separate questions. So the first question, in terms of solutions on what they focus, we follow this response hierarchy from UNCCD, which says, first of all, conserve. Next, then restore, and then reverse. That's the LDN, land degradation neutrality response hierarchy, meaning that the most important thing is to conserve natural intact ecosystem which we still have. So what we really think what is really a huge problem is that mangroves are cut and and how do you say, yeah, cut, and at the same kilometers away there are mangroves restored. And I think this is really a problem because this new planted mangroves has not the values, has not the integrity, has not the the values that is actually what a natural mangrove already can provide. So I think this conserving is really as a very important first thing. And then of course then restore if it's degraded, and reverse if it's completely kind of, I don't know. So reverse means that any can also be like build structure turned into ecosystems again, etc.
There is another question in the chat. If policymakers were to compare no nature-based solutions to green infrastructure or technology-based solutions for adaptation or disaster risk reduction, how convincing is the science of understanding the impact and efficacy of nature-based solutions over short and long time scales? And is this one of the barriers to buy-in at the policy level?
Mm. Yes, I think this is the problem is that we have too little evidence and too little long-term evidence, and that we have too much of short-term cost-benefit analysis, which are only focusing on short-term aspects. And I think this is something which is jeopardizing often the decision-making process. And that long-term values, and this is something we really want to push right now in EVIS in order to make sure that ecosystems in its full dimension in terms of what diverse values they provide, not only instrumental values, but also relational values or intrinsic values, that they are they can be seen and they can be brought into any calculations or planning. And that means, for example, these nature contribution to people concept from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services is pretty new in this regard, and gives one value, nature contribution to people, namely maintenance of option. That means how can long-term options be accounted for as one aspect, which is not at all accounted for, right, in many of these studies, right? So.
Do you have a question? Do you have a moment for one additional question, Yvonne,
Yes.
connected to this? Can you actually reopen your slides and go back to that slide where you had the economic and non-economic benefits? I think it's connected with what you are saying, and I wanted to stress an aspect.
Okay, share. Let's here.
So what Yvonne is saying, you probably recognize as something we discussed yesterday, sorry, Tuesday, when we went through the different types of values of ecosystems.
What do you mean exactly?
It was a slide where you were, I think it's the one below, maybe 22, maybe. I don't see very well. When you were discussing about economic and non-economic
This is this here.
aspects.
This was this here in the WIM, Warsaw International Mechanism, no?
Mm-hmm.
Here.
And
Maybe I can, yeah. Maybe I can increase this size here for you.
thank you. So
Bring to
one thing that
front.
I wanted to mention, and it's something that it's a recurrent issue, is that when we say when we consider benefits of ecosystems, for example, or nature-based solutions, there are benefits that can be monetized and benefits that cannot be monetized or that are difficult to be monetized. And this is in relation to also what you were saying about short-term cost-benefit analysis. Not only the cost-benefit analysis is short-term, but often it doesn't take into consideration benefits that are difficult to monetize, which are often the benefits that have longer time spans and they are related to nature dimensions that also benefit ecosystems themselves. One aspect that I wanted to stress is that for economists, even though the benefits that cannot be monetized are economic benefits, but we should call them non-monetary benefits, perhaps, because then it might legitimize people to not take them into account in a cost-benefit analysis. You see what I'm trying to say? So in the cost-benefit analysis, there should be mention also of what cannot be monetized. There are still economic benefits. So for
Yes,
economists,
speak out of my heart.
yeah, so for economists, every value, even intrinsic value, cultural value, spiritual value, those are economic values. They may not be monetized, but they are economic values. And maybe what I'm about to say might clarify this. I'm trying to connect this presentation also to what we did on Tuesday. When you think about economics, economics is the science of decision making. Economics is not just about calculating monetary values. I hope this is something that is going to be close to the heart of everybody in this school. Economics is really not just about calculating monetary values. In order to perform decision making through economic tools, we may use economic values that are monetized. But one of the problems that we are facing in protecting nature is that not all economic values related to nature are easy to monetize. And the ultimate problem is that these values are not taken into account in processes like cost benefits, where only what is monetized is taken into account. I don't know if this makes sense for everybody. I try to explain without slides, but essentially, economic value is also spiritual value. Does it make sense? It includes every possible value that humans give to environmental goods and services. But not all economic values are monetizable, and that's our problem.
How would you see it for the example of identity, Marta? I would be
Yeah,
interested.
that's also an economic value because it would be cultural value, because the identity goes down to cultural identity or spiritual identity. So there is a
So what value is it if it's not if it's non-economic, what value would it be for the
economics is really about making decision about resources. And so every aspect of the resource is going to be economic. It's like every component of the resource has a decision making implication, right? So even the existence value of a polar bear, can it be
But this
monetized?
cannot be quantified, no?
Cannot be
These are contextual
monetized.
because
Yeah,
they
it
cannot be
cannot be
monetized, but also
monetized.
not quantified, no? I mean, you
Yeah,
can quantify that 10, 20 people are impacted in their identity because of a mangrove area being impacted, something like this, but this is still not giving the value of what you lose when you lose identity, because, for example, it could be very impactful for 2 of these 20 or for 18 of the 20 or for
yeah.
everyone. This is
So
subjective, and I think there we
yeah,
can we have to understand that there are many things that are values, but they cannot be quantified and not economified in that
no,
sense.
monetized. So monetized.
Monetized. Thank you. I'm
That's
not
the
an
only thing.
economist, so
No,
I
no,
think this
I
is
really want to stress this point. You
yeah.
know why I'm stressing this point? Because then there are
Mm,
people who will say this is not efficient because it doesn't provide any economic benefits. But no,
mhm,
it's not true. It provides economic benefits. It's just that we
mhm,
cannot calculate them. Does it make sense?
mhm,
Because we don't have a market for them.
mhm,
But it doesn't mean that something that is not on a market doesn't have value. And
mhm,
this is a little battle that we need to fight with those who don't want to take into account these benefits. And it's one of the challenges that we are facing, for example, in relation to the adoption of nature-based solutions as part of insurance programs, because they can be difficult to put on Excel spreadsheets for the insurance companies. So I always want to stress this difference between monetized and economic. So they are economic values, but they cannot be easily monetized. But it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be taken into account. They should be taken into account in the decision-making process.
mm.
So cost benefit by itself is not enough. That's basically the
Yes.
bottom line
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah, I, I I think a cost-benefit analysis in the context of ecosystems should never stand alone.
Mm,
It should not stand alone. It is important. It's an important tool, but it's important to communicate what and it can be in the format of narratives or something. It's
Yeah,
very important that there are, you can tell the story of inventing penicillin because of one species that was discovered, and this can be linked to maintenance of options, you know, what things like this. I mean, there can be many stories that could be
yeah.
linked to it, for example.
Yeah, it's a very important point. It should not be
Mm-hmm.
used alone.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this is a challenge that we are facing because in several administrative instances, that's the only decision-making tool that is adopted.
Mm-hmm.
And this is very true in the US, where cost-benefit analysis is one of the requirements to pass policies. If it's the only requirement, then we may have a problem because other aspects are not taken into account. And I would like to stress another aspect related to the limitations of cost-benefit. Not only it doesn't take into account benefits that cannot be monetized, but it also doesn't consider redistribution of benefits. It just looks at the total number of benefits. So if you have two policies, in one policy, one company gets all the benefits and everybody else loses, but the benefits are very, very high for the company. And then you have another policy, policy B, where there is a lower number of total benefits, but they are distributed across a very large population. Cost benefit analysis will pick the policy A, lots of benefits only to one company because it's the total number of benefits that matters and not the distribution of the benefits. We say in economics that cost benefit analyzes efficiency, so the maximization of benefits and not the redistribution of the benefits. So this is also the reason why it should not be used alone, because there are strong implications on the population. I'm very grateful that Yvonne's talk allows us to emphasize these aspects, which we were not able to cover on Tuesday. Sorry for taking this space, Yvonne, but I think it might be valuable for our students considering the limitations of this technique.
Perfect. All good. Happy to
Yeah,
have the discussion.
yeah. So I know we are past the time and maybe Yvonne needs to go. Is there any parting word that you want to share with our students?
Well, I can only say thank you for the opportunity to Marta, and thank you for all of your interest and for the nice question and the discussion. And I wish you all the best. And yeah, if you are interested, fight for recognizing values of diverse values of ecosystems. That's something I want to give you on my way, give you on your way from my side.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. We shared the readings with the students and it has
I
been very
share the slides
engaging.
with you right now also.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, everybody asked for them. Thank you
Okay,
very much.
good. Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much. Have a good course and have a nice
Bye-bye.
evening. Bye.
Bye. If you want, we can take, if you want a mini break, we can take 5 minutes and we can be back here in 5 for Nidhi's talk.